book I read this semester was Rabbit Run by John Updike. The book was published in 1960 by Alfred A. Knopf and has 265 pages. John Updike was born March 18, 1932 in Reading, Pennsylvania. His parents were Linda and Wesley Updike. When John Updike was a child, he was highly influenced to become a writer by his mother's own attempts at becoming a published writer. These experiences influenced many of his early short stories and novels. He graduated from Shillington High School in 1950 as co-valedictorian and class president. Right after graduating, he went to Harvard after receiving a full scholarship. After graduation, John decided that he wanted to become a graphic artist and went to the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. When he got back to the United States, he moved to New York and became a regular contributor to The New Yorker. This is where his career as a writer began. John married Mary E. Pennington in 1953. Together they had 4 children, Elizabeth, Miranda, Michael, and David. In 1974, John and Mary divorced, and 3 years later, John married another woman named Martha. They were married until John's death of lung cancer in 2009. This book was published in 1960, which is about 5 years after the Vietnam War had started. John F. Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States, barely winning over Richard Nixon. The book is set during a 5-month period in 1960 in a small town in Pennsylvania called Mount Judge. This book was told in third person throughout the entire book. I enjoyed this because you got to see more views of what's going on other than just the main characters. You got to see his wives and the ministers. You got to see everyone's instead of just rabbits. Now I will tell you about some of the characters. Harry Angstrom is the main character of the book, and he's always referred to as Rabbit. That's his nickname. Rabbit is a 26-year-old, 6'3" former basketball player for his high school. He works a pretty much boring job of selling a potato peeler called the Magic Peel. Rabbit oftentimes just wants to run away from his average life just because it's pretty boring. He just wants to escape and do other things, and I'll be telling you more about that later. Janice is Rabbit's wife. She used to work at the store where he worked, but she no longer does. The book didn't really say why she doesn't work there anymore. Janice doesn't think of their marriage as bad as Rabbit does. She just kind of goes along with it because she knows that she has to raise and take care of their son and the daughter that they're about to have. Marty Tothero is Rabbit's old basketball coach. Tothero kind of helps Rabbit later on in the book when it comes to him running away from Janice. He just lets him sleep there for a couple nights. He's just gotten kind of old. Rabbit thinks he's kind of a weird guy. He doesn't really know what he's talking about, but he can still deal with him. Jack Eccles is a local minister that becomes a major part of the book when Rabbit runs away from his home. He gets involved with a lot of the things that Rabbit does away from his home, and oftentimes he'll try to kind of convince Rabbit to get back with Janice to try to get over the problems that he has with his family and realize that having a family isn't that bad. But Rabbit just doesn't seem to budge because he just doesn't like the life that he was living. Nelson is Rabbit and Janice's 2-year-old son. Nelson obviously doesn't know about much that's going on with his dad basically abandoning the family. It's ending up having a bad effect on him, but there's not really anything that he can do about it since it's his dad's fault. Janice is pretty much just left to take care of him. Ruth is a woman that becomes a major part of the story shortly after Rabbit leaves his family. Rabbit ends up living with Ruth for up to 2 months to avoid going back to his own home. He ends up also having an affair with her, and I'll be talking more about that later. Mrs. Smith is an elderly lady that owns a garden that Rabbit ends up helping taking care of for a few months while he's away from his home. Some minor characters in the story include Mrs. and Mrs. Springer, who are Janice's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Angstrom, which are Rabbit's parents. There's Lucy Eccles, who is Jack Eccles' wife, and then there's also Margaret, which is the second woman that Tothero and Rabbit end up eating with, including Ruth. I'll be telling you more about that in the summary. Now I will tell you about the summary of Rabbit Run. The book itself is actually only divided into 3 chapters, which just separate major breaks of time where things don't really change. So chapters in this book aren't used at all, other than to just separate major breaks of time. The book starts off with a basketball game between some 12-year-old boys, and Rabbit gets off of work and he sees them playing and he decides to join in for a little while. He does pretty good considering that he was a former basketball superstar at high school. Then he goes home to his wife, Janice, who has just been recently pregnant with their second child, and after Rabbit gets irritated by Janice over a few trivial things, Janice asks for some cigarettes, to ask him to go get some cigarettes. He says yes, but when he leaves, he decides that he's actually going to travel south. He just wants to go south. He just wants to get away from Janice. He just wants to get away from the problems because he's getting pretty sick of Janice. So he starts traveling south. It takes him a few hours, and he gets down to West Virginia. Then he realizes that he just can't keep going south anymore. So he decides to turn around and come back to Brewer. He doesn't go back home though. When he gets back to Mount Judge, he instead visits his old basketball coach, Marty Tethero. He goes there and he just kind of stays there for a while. He stays there overnight just so he doesn't have to go back home. And then when he wakes up the next morning, he and Marty decide that they want to go out with the night with two women that Marty knows that he think would be kind of a good mashup with Rabbit, just to someone else other than his wife. Marty tries to give him some like opinions about his marriage, but since he's gotten kind of old, it doesn't really make much sense. Rabbit doesn't really listen to him too much, though. He doesn't think of them too seriously. He just agrees to go with him out that night because he might think he might have a fun experience. You know, do something different than what he's just been doing in his life more recently. That night he goes with Tethero and the two women to a restaurant, and the women's two names are Ruth and Margaret. And they just, overall, they just kind of talk, they just kind of eat, and then after they leave, Ruth and Rabbit go back to her apartment, and they end up having an affair. And he ends up spending the night. In the morning he realizes that once Ruth grows fond of him, that he's actually going to stay there. He's going to live there for a long time instead of going back home. Over the span of a couple months, they end up just doing quite a few things together. You know, he's staying away from home. He hasn't really heard from the wife hasn't heard from him. She ends up living, the wife ends up moving in back with her parents while he's gone. She doesn't seem to question it too much throughout the book. In the meantime, Rabbit befriends this local minister named Jack Eccles. He becomes a big part of the book. He's just kind of there throughout the rest of the book, and he just kind of provides information, and he also tries to convince Rabbit to get back with Janice, and his wife also thinks that they should get back together. They think that him basically giving up on the life that he has is not a very good thing to do, and that he should just go back to his family life. But Rabbit never seems to budge. Jack at one point convinces Rabbit to get a job to help this elderly woman, Mrs. Smith, with her garden. And he ends up taking that job, and for 2 months he just kind of keeps doing the stuff that he's been doing, like with Jack and Ruth, and he's also helping with Mrs. Smith's garden. It's like he's living a completely different life. And then after this goes on for a while, Rabbit finds out that his wife is now in labor with their second child. So he ends up traveling to the hospital with Jack, and he meets her there for the first time in a long time, and the baby is born shortly thereafter. Soon now, Rabbit has basically left Ruth and gone back with Janice to, help with the brand new baby, whose name is Rebecca June, which ended up actually the name was a compromise between Janice and Rabbit, which they both wanted one of the names. Rabbit liked June, but Janice liked Rebecca. They're just back at home. They're just kind of raising it up a little bit. I mean, she's a newborn, and they realize how difficult raising a newborn can be. Then one night, Rabbit and Janice kind of get into an argument, and Rabbit just leaves, and he just kind of starts walking around just kind of thinking about stuff. And before he leaves, he tells Janice, to have a drink to calm her down, because she's, being kind of upset. So she ends up having some drinks. She ends up having way too many drinks. And then her mom calls and says that she's going to come over, even though Janice said to her that she really did not want her to come over. The mother just persisted, and she said that she'd be over in 20 minutes. And in a drunken fit of rage, she ends up trying to wash the baby because she thinks he's dirty, and she drowns Rebecca June in a bathtub. A short amount of time passes, and they end up arranging a funeral for Rebecca June. When they are at the gravesite, when they're lowering the coffin into the ground like they do at all funeral services, Rabbit kind of gets a sense from everyone that's standing around that they think that it's his fault. It's like his fault for leaving. I mean, he did leave, and it's his fault that he left. But he thinks that the reason why their newborn daughter is dead is because of him leaving during the time of need that Janice was in, him just not being there for the daughter. And with this, he gets mad, and then he just takes off running from the cemetery. And this is where the title of the book comes in. He just takes off running far away, and Jack Eccles tries to chase him, but he ends up losing him. And he just keeps running. He just runs, and he ends up not knowing where he is, but he just loves the feel of the running, just getting away from the problem at hand. He eventually arrives at Ruth's apartment, and then I can't tell you what happens because that's the end of the book. The symbolism that I found in this book is pretty much just the running that is like mentioned in the title. Throughout the book, Rabbit just tries to run away from his problems, just to try to get away to lead a different life. And how near the end he just kind of runs away from the funeral, just tries to lead a different path, but he doesn't realize that that has negative effects on people in his life, like his wife and his child. I can relate to this book because there's been situations in my life where you just kind of feel like you just want to run away, you just want to keep your problems behind, you just don't want to deal with them, you just want to get away from them, but then you realize that you can't because you running away from them has a negative effect on everyone else in your life. Just how Harry realized that in the book when he ran away from his family. Rabbit Run itself has not won any awards, but John Updike himself has won over 30 awards for all of his novels, including the sequels to Rabbit Run. A good lesson that this book teaches is that what you do has consequences on everyone else. When Rabbit thought that what he was doing was a good thing, just him trying to get away from his typical middle-class life, he's actually affecting his family and people relating to his family in the long run. It just has a bad effect. It just kind of trickles down over time. It just gets worse. And it teaches you well that what you do definitely has consequences on other people. John Updike has written many other novels, including 3 sequels to Rabbit Run, which are titled Rabbit Redux, Rabbit is Rich, and Rabbit Rest, which basically just follow Rabbit's life further on throughout time. Updike has also written many other novels and trilogies. Some of his other works includes Of the Farm, Brazil, and then his most recent novel, Terrorist. John Updike relates to Rabbit Run because he himself is much like Rabbit in the sense that they both live kind of the same life. They're both just a middle-class family, like with wife and children, and they're both Christians too. I would not recommend reading this book. There wasn't really any point during the book that it really caught my interest. It was just pretty boring. It just didn't have any big eventful scenes or anything exciting happening. It's just pretty average. I wouldn't read it again, and I don't really think I'd recommend it to you guys either. If you do read it though, recommended age level would probably be 9th grade up. While the book didn't have a major impact on just the general audience, Rabbit Run is noted as being one of several well-regarded early usage of present tense. And for many others, the novel basically just teaches that main lesson that what you can do has a major influence on everyone. The novel showed just how a middle-class family could change so drastically for the worse just by one bad move of one person.